In the Thomas Gospel, Jesus says, "He who drinks from my mouth will become as I am, and I shall be he." Wow, that's Buddhism. We are all manifestations of Buddha consciousness, only don't know it. And the Buddha, the word means the one who waked up, bod, to wake, woke up to the fact that he was Buddha consciousness. And we are all to do that. To wake up to our Jesus within us. This is blasphemy in the normal way of thinking in Christianity, but it's the very essence of Gnosticism and of the Thomas Gospel.
And heaven, that desired goal of most people, is within us?
All the gods, all the heavens, all the worlds are within us. They are magnified dreams, and what dreams are manifestations in image form of the energies of the body in conflict with each other.
Thanks so much for that, Papa Joe. And hello there to all of you. Happy heresies and welcome to the desert of the real. Welcome so much to Ambite Gnostic Radio, your weekly dose of heresy, conspiracy, consciousness, and other red pill suppositories. We don't take prisoners but liberate them. We are not the final authority on anything, but hope to be an endless possibility for everything. Divided we stand, together we rise.
Before this battle is over, the world will know that few stood against many.
All of this gnosis is more important than ever in these surreal, Logan's Run oppressive times. One of the best solutions is remembering what we were before they made us forget. As the Gospel of Philip says, ignorance is the greatest of sins. I mean, recently there was a story saying that 4 in 10 millennials don't know about the Holocaust. I'm sure it's just as bad as other moments in historical time. The point is that the Archons want us to forget, not know, and then force us to gurgle and swallow the latest propaganda. That's how the powers and principalities ultimately defeat us, with ignorance. After all, the truth shall set you free, but freedom is always what the elite fight against. And the truth is the first casualty in any war, as the saying goes. And a psychic war against humanity has been raging since the day we were cast in monkey suits millennia ago.
What truth? That you are a slave, Neo. Like everyone else, you were born into bondage, born into a prison that you cannot smell or taste or touch. A prison for your mind.
Of course, you should find your own damn truth and recall what you need to recall. Total recall. You should run with those searching for the truth and avoid those who have found it. As I've said before, Gnosis is just the right information that liberates you and only you today to be the most authentic and best version of yourself. A heroic storyteller that can truly help others.
You're not your job. You're not how much money you have in the bank. You're not the car you drive. You're not the contents of your wallet. You're not your fucking khakis.
The other solution to these oppressive times is to make art and magic, because the elite are already using both against you. As the saying goes, millionaires don't use astrology, but billionaires do use astrology. All art is political, Caitlin Johnstone said. And like Philip K. Dick said in his exegesis, art is the ultimate defiance of fate. So remember, yes, remember, to create better than the rulers of this age. Like the Gospel of Thomas says, when you give rise to that which is within you, what you have will save you. If you do not give rise to it, what you do not have will destroy you. You have it within you, trust me, and it's crucial you bring it out today. People talk whether we live in a Orwellian or Huxley reality, but the truth is we live in a perfect and destructive blend. I would call that blend a Dickian reality. As in Philip K. Dick.
I mean, the world can kick your ass. I only have a vague recollection when it wasn't kicking mine.
Every passing day, we are taking one step closer to a dictatorship. And we don't even know who the real dictators are.
So welcome one more time, and so glad you're here with me. With your host, Miguel Connor, broadcasting in the lawful but frigid dystopia of Chicago. In this eternal now, we are going to talk about how things are not totally hopeless, as we do live in both a New Age and Gnostic America. The population is dying and living for alternatives to the horse manure realities provided by Jehovah and his angelic mafia. What's more, our astral guest will be granting a remarkable recap to the Gnostic America Conference, as he was there, and I really enjoyed his warm and erudite company. That is Mitch Horowitz, who materializes at the virtual Alexandria for a first but overdue time. Beyond a leading voice in modern esoterica and occultism, Mitch is the author of such kick-ass books that include the seminal Occult America. So glad to have met him, and glad he is here for the interview that covers so much, including how to survive these digital doom times. I mean, can occultists be guilty of appropriation? And can we regain civil discourse in society? Can Gnosticism translate for modern audiences? And can our thoughts really shape reality? We'll find this out and so much more.
Do not try and bend the spoon. That's impossible. Instead, only try to realize the truth.
What truth?
There is no spoon.
There is no spoon?
Then you'll see that it is not the spoon that bends, it is only yourself.
For more information on Mitch, please visit, you got it, MitchHorowitz.com. Or check out our show notes for some links. And yes, Mitch proudly calls himself a New Ager. And Yaldi Baldi knows I've taken the piss out of New Age for years, even if I've been accused of it. But as April DeConnick argues in the Gnostic New Age, the Gnostics were indeed the New Agers of their time. Regardless, Mitch puts out a great apologetic for New Age, so I'll stop making fun of the movement now.
I want to become a guru so girls will like me. Then I will like myself.
Okay, I mean now. Might as well, because as Benjamin Franklin said right before the American Revolution, gentlemen, if we don't hang together, surely we'll hang apart. But enough of my drivel. Let us to the interview with Mitch Horowitz. First a poem by Caitlin Johnstone, as I'm digging her persona of a philosopher, poet, and activist. Oh, hominid, you are a big fish in a small pond. No, that's wrong. You are a big fish in a small fish tank, a celestial leviathan at the apex of evolution, imprisoned in an artificial box that was manufactured in a sweatshop. We are gods in cages, made of insurance commercials and war propaganda. The feral behemoths are growing wary of their chains, which hang from their necks like overboiled spaghetti. Soon oceans of wolves will howl from their chests, and the brain boxes will burst like soap bubbles. and the dull gaze of the manipulators will be met with the savage eyes of every species that has ever lived. The propagandists have been perfected their sick science for about a century, give or take. Your cells have been mastering this dance for 3.5 billion years. Your atoms have been at this since the birth of the universe. The fight between the primordial beasts and the mental diddlers is not a fair one. Toddlers outgrow their clothing, no matter how loose and stretchy you buy it, while primates outgrow their cages, no matter how tightly you seal them in. I can hear the braying, the yowling and snarling. It is growing louder and louder. Go take your hand and place it on the earth, O hominid. This is your home. This is all the permission you require. The primal eyes snap open. They outnumber the stars.
When you come to think of it, almost all human behavior and activity is not essentially any different from animal behavior. The most advanced technologies and craftsmanship bring us, at best, up to the super chimpanzee level. Actually, the gap between, say, Plato or Nietzsche and the average human is greater than the gap between that chimpanzee and the average human. The realm of the real spirit, the true artist, the saint, the philosopher, is rarely achieved. Why so few? Why is world history and evolution not stories of progress, but rather this endless and futile addition of zeros? No greater values have developed. Hell, the Greeks 3,000 years ago were just as advanced as we are. So what are these barriers that keep people from reaching anywhere near their real potential? The answer to that can be found in another question, and that's this. Which is the most universal human characteristic? Fear or laziness?
This is the AM Bite interview, and with us we definitely have the pleasure of having Mitch Horowitz. How you doing today, Mitch?
I'm great. Good to be here with you, man.
Hey, man, it's great having you on. And again, it was, as we mentioned, it was great meeting you at the Gnostic Amera conference at Rice University in Houston. And hopefully we can unpack all the great insights we had. So, yeah, thanks for being on.
Absolutely. That conference was amazing. I wanted to engineer a Occupy Gnosis and never leave. I didn't want to depart.
Yes. It was awesome. It was just so much good content and conversations. It was enlightening, but that's what we're here. Like, as we mentioned, we're here to continue that vibe. Yep. But, first for the audience who might not know about you, and shame on them, of course, but, tell us a little bit about yourself, perhaps how you became interested in the esoteric in general.
Sure. I'm a historian of alternative spirituality, and I call myself a believing historian. I'm also a participant in the occult and esoteric and Gnostic movements that I document. And I became interested because about 20 plus years ago, I went to work for a metaphysical publisher that was then known as Tarcher Penguin, and I began to read deeply into the backlist and discover various books on Zen and New Thought and different aspects of mysticism. And I just completely fell into it, like diving into a pool. And I came to feel that not only did these ideas have the capacity to be transforming in my life and the life of other seekers, but the figures behind these ideas very often weren't getting their due in mainstream history, mainstream journalism. They were either ignored, unrecognized, or frankly, sometimes just mocked. And I didn't think that was a satisfying state of affairs. And it became clear to me that if you don't write your own history, you're going to get it written for you. And it might very well get written by people who don't share your values or who don't understand the ideas and the principles that emanate from the traditions you're invested in. So I began to write the history of some of these figures myself, and that resulted in my first book, Occult America, My second book was called One Simple Idea, which is a history of positive mind metaphysics. And I've written many books since then. I have a new one coming out in the month of October called The Miracle Club, which is my best assessment of what really works in the whole area of mind metaphysics, or what people sometimes call the law of attraction, or the secret, or the power of positive thinking. These ideas, although in many regards they're perennial, they've bopped around in their modern form, say over the past 150 years. Some people dedicate their lives to them. Some people can't stand them and think that there's nothing here to be taken seriously. My aim in the Miracle Club is to really pour through the last 150 years of practices and techniques and ask the question, what works? What's defensible? What's a serious path here? And I think there's so much there for serious people to find. So that's what I'm working on currently.
Wonderful. We look forward to that book, and I love that believing historian. So that's really cool, and we certainly want to unpack some of these ideas as we go along the interview. But why don't we get to the event itself? Tell us about your experience at the Gnostic America Conference, or some of the takeaways you had.
The Gnostic America Conference, which was just recently held at Rice University, convened by April D. DeConnick and Jeffrey Kripal, was just extraordinary. And it was extraordinary because it was a group of scholars, some academically affiliated, some independent, who take seriously the question of the mystical search, who take seriously extraphysical and esoteric experience, who look at occult and Gnostic and New Age movements not as these social oddities to be dissected and put under glass in a museum case somewhere, but as living, breathing traditions with a serious history, with a powerful present. And I have to tell you, it was far and away the best scholarly conference that I've ever attended. And it was the most rewarding because it so upended this convention that permeates so much of the academic study of religion, which is ultimately that the testimony of experience and the testimony of believers doesn't matter. The experiences of seekers don't matter. The life-changing potential of religious or spiritual ideas are beside the point, if there even is such a thing. All of that was set aside, and we were able to talk about Gnostic and occult and esoteric movements, not only in the context of their history, their development, their retention by people like us in the 21st century, but the real impact that they have on the lives of seekers. And some of the people present at the conference, this includes you and me, were able to speak forthrightly about our own experiences as individual seekers, not solely as people who document, but as people who participate. And that was extraordinary. And this was all done in an atmosphere of real seriousness and focus and discipline, but at the same time with real openness and ingenuousness. I think everybody felt the liberty to speak freely about their own spiritual interests, search, commitments. And that is so precious and so rare at a scholarly conference where people almost seem to regard disbelief, unbelief, dismissal as the fee of entry to serious discussion. And that is such a mistake. And it's also dishonest because behind every religious scholar, there's usually some sort of a story. He or she very often came to this work because of a personal search. And yet, for professional reasons, they feel required frequently to kind of push down and hide that aspect of themselves. Or some even go to the extent of serving as kind of intellectual cops who want others to push down and deny the validity of experience as the fee of entry, so to speak, to professional discussion, to professional conferences, to publication in scholarly journals. And this was so the opposite. I wish so many different people from so many different walks of life could have been there because it would have revolutionized their ideas about how we can talk about and study religion.
Agreed. I mean, it was Yeah, the amount of content was very potent, and I don't go to many scholar conferences, but I hear about them, and what I liked is the camaraderie was really strong away from the lectures, to the point that we could all joke around but also get into some serious conversations, whether it was the lizard people or Philip K. Dick, it didn't matter. I mean, I remember at one point we were having a banquet and it was like 10 people, and the conversation was Trump, and this is the first time in years it was just a very serious level and esoteric idea on usually a topic where you're going to get some fighting. And no matter what the topic, everybody was cool, everybody was joking, and everybody was insightful.
Right. I totally agree. I mean, it was really remarkable. Like you were talking about some of the reptilian theories and things like that. You know, there were a couple of speakers, you and Eric Wargo in particular, who spoke about the development of a conspiracy culture within the New Age and Gnostic worlds, and how this sometimes coincides with a right-wing or an angry politics, not always. And we were able to talk about that without it turning into this political food fight, but saying, look, you know, this is part of the neighborhood that has sprung up around the modern branches of Gnosticism. And we can either deal with it, acknowledge it, discuss it, or, you know, run the other way and ignore it, but we're not going to learn anything. And we also do have to ask ourselves as Gnostic seekers questions about what we have on our hands. Are we dealing with Woodstock, or are we dealing with Altamont, if everybody remembers their rock and roll history?
Yes.
Or are we dealing with both, you know? And maybe it's inevitable that we're going to wind up dealing with both, that there are going to be some ideas that come out of Gnosticism that are very liberatory, and some of the ideas that come out, which in my view lead us into a really dark ditch of conspiracism and us versus them thinking. But we have to be able to talk about that, and we have to be able to kind of take ownership of that and say, you know, is there something in our teachings? Is there something in the way these teachings have been interpreted that direct us towards an angry politics sometimes? And what does that mean? And what is that reflecting? Is it reflecting truth? Is it reflecting a hijacking of truth? I personally believe it's reflecting a hijacking of truth, but that doesn't mean that the impulses behind it can be ignored. People all over our country have this correct instinct that there's a need for greater transparency in all of our institutions, and they're completely right. Personally speaking, I get concerned that that zeal for transparency, which is good and right, sometimes gets hijacked into conspiracy theories, and people forget about the fact that they are getting screwed over by their health insurance company. They've paid for coverage, and there's some guy who figured out that if you hassle or ignore a legitimate claimant, some percentage of those people will just go away. And that's what's happening to people in our country today. And I think that requires a lot of daylight, and I think that requires fixing and investigation. I don't think that's the result of a conspiracy. I think it's the result of unregulated capitalism. It's a serious problem. But for some people, things like that either are the result of a conspiracy, or it's more titillating, it's more entertaining, it's more thrilling to look in the direction of a conspiracy. And I say, you know, if you want to get thrills by self-experiment. Don't get thrills by falling into a kind of us versus them paradigm. But these are the kinds of things we were able to discuss. And it was so valid and it was so useful. And your presentation in particular was great for me, because you have these dialogues and you have them in a civil and constructive way. And you were able to kind of bring that into the mix. And people needed to hear that. They needed to hear that. We can't, no one of us can be oblivious to these things that are going on in our culture, or to turn away from them and say, that's a bunch of garbage, I'm not going to pay attention to it. And you brought that into the mix, and that was extremely constructive.
Oh, well, thank you very much. I enjoyed all of the lectures. Yours was great. We need to address it, but were you surprised at all about the theme of conspiracy theory that came out from Heaven's Gate to David Icke? I mean, there was one lecturer who talked about how we live in a time, I think it's the ultra conspiracy, where we all sort of Lego and put on top our different conspiracies. Were you surprised at that, or you just, you found, Mitch, that we do live in a conspiracy theory society and that's just the way it is?
Yeah, I think we do live in a conspiracy theory society, and I wasn't surprised. I was glad that material was part of the event, because again, it needs to be considered. Nobody can afford to say, I'm just not going to pay attention to that because I find it distasteful. And people also have to draw lines as to what they'll participate in and what they won't. You know, I get invited on different shows and to participate in different projects all the time. And I, in some cases, have to make a judgment call as to how much is too much with regard to the manner in which conspiracy theories are part of the neighborhood or part of the mix. Now, as your listeners can tell from the comments I made previously, I am gravely concerned about conspiracy thinking. I think that conspiracy thinking, which is to say an us versus them attitude or an excessive analysis of hidden hands, hidden groups, hidden bloodlines controlling things, my view is that that's profoundly obfuscating and unhelpful and paranoid and angry and steers us into a really, really dark place. At the same time, I am not always able to, and I'm not always willing to, wall myself off from that approach. Some of those discussions occur on Coast to Coast AM. I go on Coast to Coast all the time. I'm doing a live chat with George Noory tonight, and I'm happy to be doing so. And I understand, I feel that George understands my perspective, and we don't cross into those neighborhoods when I'm on, other than to criticize them should that come up. I write from time to time for New Dawn magazine, which is published out of Australia. They deal with some of that material. But again, I feel I just did an interview with them yesterday, actually, about our Gnostic America conference. They understand and respect my perspective and where I'm coming from. If I'm in a neighborhood where that respect becomes impossible, where there's just kind of anger at any dissension from what might loosely be called the conspiratorial point of view, I don't go into that neighborhood. Because then it's almost like you can only be viewed as an adversary. You can only be viewed as an enemy or as an archon, of the wrong kind. And, I take some of that heat sometimes. I mean, I've been on shows where somebody's asked me about, the Illuminati or something. And, for example, I think the Illuminati historically was a wonderful development. They were a collection of radical Democrats who had a taste for the occult aesthetic, and their values and their principles were very much aligned with First Amendment or Jeffersonian values and principles, and they were also renegade Freemasons. I think they were a wonderful group historically, and today do not exist. They are a urban legend floating around the digital sphere today. They are part of a self-referencing loop of information where people prove they exist by quoting people who connect up ideas that are very loosely symbolical or coincidental, ranging from, government imagery to cultural images and such that can almost be fitted together as though they're pieces from out of a dreamscape that can be interpreted in the eye of the beholder. I've gotten tremendous hate for that point of view, as if by just saying that, I'm invalidating or challenging somebody's orientation of reality. And I won't go into a neighborhood where saying my piece automatically renders me a part of the other side, because I'm not on any side. I have a question. A seeker and a questioner doesn't belong to a side. He goes everywhere. As Krishnamurti said, the truth is a pathless land. But I'm not going to go somewhere where I have to wear the label of adversary in order to have a discussion. So that was part of our conference too, and it was helpful for me to be able to speak to people about where I draw the line, because we can't deny the territory that's on our map, and the conspiracy approach is part of the territory, and everybody has to figure out and determine, okay, how do I relate to this?
Well said. And one of the main themes at the Gnostic America Conference, Mitch, was the idea of negative gnosis versus positive gnosis. Yeah. What do you think about this? Personally, I think that there really is no difference, because gnosis is so personal. It really depends where you are, what your relation to the world is, and really what's going on. But what do you think?
Well, it's an interesting question. Is there a positive gnosis? Is there a negative gnosis? Off the cuff, I would say the positive gnosis, if I can put it in such terms, is the search, is the boundaryless search. The negative gnosis, in my view, is almost a buying into an us versus them conspiratorial thinking, which is the precise end of the search. People think they're seeking when they are mining all these different territories for secret conspiracies, secret bloodlines, etc. But they've already settled into such a certainty of who the good guys and bad guys are. And of course, the seeker is always wearing the good guy's hat somehow, that I think it's the closing down of the search. My challenge to the person who is invested in conspiratorial thinking, and I realize people don't always like to be described that way, and I understand that. I'm not trying to apply a pejorative to anybody. I'm speaking generally. But my challenge is not that we're going to go toe-to-toe with your footnotes versus my footnotes, because we both have plenty of footnotes, I can assure you. You know, if there's no shortage of anything, it's references and resources that people can endlessly cite vis-a-vis the digital culture today. So I'm not going toe-to-toe with anybody and pitting my footnotes against theirs. That's purposeless. That will just go on forever and ever, and we see those kinds of debates go on endlessly online, and they descend into a very dark place. That's not the point. The point is, the search gets closed down when the individual ceases to look within. And I mean that in the most serious way. If you're looking for the adversary outside of yourself, your search is closed down, because the individual has to ask, not, gee, what is going on in the world, but how do I relate? How am I in relation to the other people around me? Life is relationships. Life is relationships. Those relationships extend into commerce, into family, into marriage, into siblings, into family trees, into coworkers, into people who surround you in a wide variety of ways each and every day. What would they say? What would they say about how I, as the individual, relate to them? Do I keep my word? Do I serve as a source of productivity? Do I serve as a source of friction? Do I follow through on everything that I'm supposed to do? Am I an honorable person, broadly defined? Am I a loyal person, broadly defined? And less so do I need to answer that question than other people around me need to answer it for me. And if the answer is in doubt, then to me, that's where the search begins. But when you point a finger outward, it makes it so much easier and more entertaining and more thrilling, because the person who's pointing the finger outward is always the good guy, is always wearing the white hat. And the black-hatted guys are the Bilderberg Group or Skull and Bones or the Illuminati or this, that, or the other thing. And that's thrilling. And that's also relieving me of any responsibility to engage authentically in the inner search. So I think that an us versus them way of thinking closes down the search. It closes down the search. So I don't know if you can call that a negative gnosis, because in a certain sense, it's the absence of gnosis. And that's my perspective. And we see both branches in our world today.
Yeah, very apparent. It reminds me of what Carl Jung said about, if you don't look inward, if you don't see what your unconscious is telling you, then everything outside of you appears a fate. Everything is your shadows out there controlling you.
Right, including me. You know, I mean, I get hate from people who say, you know, you're just some sort of a positive agent for the Illuminati or this or that.
Yeah, they gotta label you.
I don't get that often, but I do get it. And I understand too, there's a thrill in people being angry. You know, I mean, it's a huge, huge turn on. Now, of course, all my talk about inner search, you know, isn't to say that we don't have very serious roles to play in the outer world. And I believe in aspirational spirituality. I don't take a namby-pamby approach to the spiritual path where it all has to be inner or it all has to be grouped under some banner of healing the world. I think that the individual has very legitimate aspirations in outer life, things that he or she wants to accomplish, wants to get done, artistic things, commercial things, family things, intimate things. We all want to create. If we really are in the image of the Creator, then it's our nature to create. And I don't think we should be embarrassed about that. I don't think we should limit that. I think aspirations in outer life, including very clear commercial or artistic aspirations, are a sacred expression of who we are. So I'm not trying to counsel some high-sounding navel-gazing either. I mean, I really do believe that the search should facilitate the individual's effectiveness in outer life as well.
On a lighter note, were there any fun conversations you had outside of the lectures? I mean, I can mention one. A couple of times we were talking.
I thought that was the lighter note. I thought that was no, I'm joking.
Yeah, exactly. Well, it depends on what negative or positive gnosis you're having, right?
The conversations outside were just terrific. I mean, quite frankly, sitting down and having a beer and be able to talking about, Course in Miracles and just the different experiences that people have had personally. And also, frankly, hearing what some of our friends in academia have to deal with. I mean, you and I are independent seekers. So, to a very great extent, we're able to write our own ticket. But for our friends in academia, they have professional pressures that they feel that maybe keep them from being more expressive of who they are. And one thing that really turned me on is that I could tell about 48 hours into the conference, people were really opening up. There were people who have professional academic appointments, tenure track positions, who might have felt at first, gee, I'm not sure, who I'm surrounded by. I'm not sure the tenor, the tone of this event. And I found that within a couple of days, people were really feeling much more relaxed and willing to be more freewheeling in their discussions. And that really turned me on quite a bit.
Agreed.
Say you were going to cite something.
Yeah.
The lighter side. What was it?
Oh, yes. A couple of times there was a discussion about who would be the New Age Pope. And of course, we're sitting at a table again at Valhalla having a beer or something. And, names were thrown around. Should it be Gary Lockman? Should it be Jeffrey Kripal? And it sort of made me laugh in reflection because I realized, oh my God, even us heretics and anarchists and occultists, we're still trying to create an order and a hierarchy in it's like it's human nature.
Right. Well, I love both Gary Lackman and Jeffrey Kripal. Gary, I would put in charge of the, I don't know, what was the inquisitory branch of the church, the Order of the Congregation of the Faithful or something, just because I honor and I respect and I love him so much. But the Pope would have to be Jeff in my book because Jeff is so judicious. I've never seen Jeff, get bent out of shape about anything. And Jeff, for those who don't know among your listeners, is a professor of religion at Rice University, until recently was the chair of the Department of Religion at Rice, and just is one of the most innovative, thrilling scholars out there studying the alternative religious landscape. And the man is unflappable. He's just the most remarkably even-tempered figure and diplomatic figure in the truest sense that I've ever met. I was joking with some people that maybe somebody was going to get drunk or something and, come into their conference presentation hungover the next day and start railing against everybody, you crystal gazing, peanut shell eating snowflakes, this is all a bunch of bullshit.
You're all out of order. The whole thing's out of order.
Exactly. And Jeff would be like, okay, that's a very helpful perspective. And now we're, so I think that Jeff, I would have to name Pope if we had one because he's so diplomatic. I mean, there's nowhere Jeff won't go and serve as a kind of peacemaker and an enabler of constructive discussion. It's uncanny. It's absolutely uncanny.
Agreed,
so I believe Jeff will actually save us all someday.
There we go. Again, human nature. We're looking for a savior, but
right,
exactly. And Jeff will tell us, you got to save yourself.
Right. Right. We got it.
Yeah. And, you were going to present your paper, The New Age of Gnosticism, but like Eric Davis, you decided to improvise when it happened and let the Spirit take you where you needed to go. Tell us why you decided to do this. Like Eric, you just decided there was a vibe in the air and you were just going to run with it?
Well, I had actually decided it beforehand because my style is to speak extemporaneously. I'll always stick to whatever the theme at hand is. And I'll always stay on topic and within the time frame, but extemporaneous speaking is what comes most naturally to me, and I think it's most satisfying for my listener. So we were given two tasks. One is to write a paper for the conference, which I did, of course, and the other was to read and present the paper. And I thought to myself, well, I've never read from a paper at a conference before. And again, speaking in a more extemporaneous way is my natural approach. So I asked April DeConnick and Jeff if this would be okay. Could I depart from the text and just speak extemporaneously? And they very graciously said yes, without any hesitation. And I was very glad for that. So I sat down and I finished my paper, The New Age in Gnosticism. And the purpose of my paper was to connect the attitude of ancient Gnosis with contemporary New Age, which I think is an attitude of radical search, and I celebrate both. And I think for that reason, the New Age is a very legitimate expression. When I use New Age, by the way, I mean this radically ecumenical culture of therapeutic spirituality that we find ourselves in. It's very porous, it's very open, it's very flexible. I'm very aware that a lot of people use New Age as a kind of epithet or an insulting term to connote an unserious or trendy or fickle or shallow approach to religion. That's not how I use it at all. And I don't believe that we should permit our critics solely to define these terms. So I apply the term New Age to myself, as I was very direct in saying to people, because I don't think we should just cede certain terms to people who use them in a negative way. And so the purpose of my paper was to draw connections, not so much in family tree, but in attitude between ancient Gnosticism and contemporary New Age. And so I wrote the paper. I was very happy with how the paper came out. And the paper, along with the papers of the other conference participants, will eventually be published by Brill in a monograph. And I chose to enunciate the themes of my paper in a more freewheeling way in front of the conference. And I recorded it. I was glad I did. And I posted it up on YouTube so people can find the audio of the paper on the New Age and Gnosticism up on YouTube. And I was glad I did. I wish more people had recorded their talks.
Right.
That some arrangement had been made. I realize it's tough. These things are complicated in ways that people don't always appreciate. But I just wanted more of the talks to be preserved. So anyway, I just took that step of recording and posting my own. And I was very pleased with the reaction to it because I felt it was necessary to stand up and identify myself as a participant within New Age culture, not just somebody who's applying the term to other people or using the term in a very loose way or using it as an epithet, but rather saying, I search within this culture and there are serious problems within this culture and I don't intend to turn away from those problems. There's a lack of maturity, there's a childishness, there's an ahistoricism, there's a lack of intellectual rigor, and there's also the opposite of all those things. So we have a very mixed bag within the New Age culture. The academic world often doesn't understand it. The journalistic world almost never understands it. and that's what motivated me to start writing some of this history as a believing historian, as somebody who emerges from the movements that he's writing about. And there's lots of precedent for that, especially in the religious world. I mean, many, many histories of religious figures or movements, some of the most important such histories, have been written by people from within those movements, people who are actually part of the Catholic faith or Judaism or the new religious movements like Christian Science or Mormonism. The most important biography of Joseph Smith, for example, the Mormon prophet, is written by Richard Lyman Bushman, who's a dedicated member of the LDS Church. Some of the most important biographical writing about Mary Baker Eddy has been written by Robert Peel or Stephen Gottschalk, both of whom were parts of the Christian Science Church. And they were very capable of being critical historians, but they also emerged from the movements that they were writing about. And the same is true for me when I write about the history of occult or esoteric movements. That is my search. I am a participant in those movements, and I'm willing to have those labels applied to me. I think it's very important that we be blunt and we be clear from time to time about our commitments. I'm not saying that every historian has to stand up and make some sort of a declaration about his religious or political background. I certainly don't think of it that way. This is all very voluntary stuff, and sometimes it's unnecessary. But when you're dealing with movements that are traditionally associated with margins, I think it can become, if not necessary, then at least helpful. And it's helpful because, again, the term New Age is so often used as an insult. And I think that we lose the historical meaning and integrity of that term. We lose the roots of that term if we just completely allow it to be defined or redefined by its critics. So I felt as a historian I needed to make it clear that that's the neighborhood that I'm coming from, and my defense is a critical defense and a defense written from the inside where I see the problems very clearly and I take them very, very seriously. I also see the good things, and by the good things I mean a culture of search, a culture of radical ecumenism, a culture of flexible boundaries that give the individual a chance to really search for meaning in perhaps the freest way in human history. So there's a lot to celebrate about the New Age. And that was the content of both my paper and my presentation. And I was just thrilled with the way it was received. It was a very critical discussion. And at the same time, I thought it was wonderful that in a scholarly setting, we could talk about New Age in a more objective way and not just in this kind of eye-rolling way.
Yes, it was, and that became sort of a theme of the conference, and I even wrote down when you were doing your lecture about how New Age is a specific term for radical ecumenical culture of therapeutical spirituality. I was like, whoa, that's really good. We're getting somewhere. And of course, there were the issues with New Age. One of them, which you brought up, was the idea that New Age, unlike other movements, doesn't provide scholars with enough gravitas and is terrible with administration.
Right, right. And maybe that's par for the course. You know, maybe if you're an anarchic movement, you have to have lousy administration. But I think that I do think, and I'm speaking generally, but I'm not speaking glibly, the New Age movement has failed to produce much in the way of serious scholarship. That is to say, scholars from within its own ranks. Contrast that to, say, Mormonism or Christian Science, where the scholarship is really excellent. I mean, it's quite considerable. And to speak of a spiritual but non-religious movement, look at Freemasonry. There's Freemasonic scholars who come out of lodges themselves who are outstanding. I mean, there has been self-documentation of history within Freemasonry that really stands up to some of the best academic work. By contrast, the New Age has not produced a large number of really good scholars, I think, which is why it's so easy for the movement to be caricatured within journalism and within academia. There's also very often, a lack of professionalism, a lack of business acumen, a lack of know-how, a lack of accountability within a lot of New Age movements. I'm speaking of growth centers, metaphysical churches, journals, websites, blog talk programs, radio programs. There are great exceptions to this. I just came back from a conference where I was speaking at the Association for Research and Enlightenment in Virginia Beach. That's the Edgar Cayce Foundation. Incredibly well-run place. The Theosophical Society of America in Wheaton, Illinois. Incredibly well-run. Esalen Institute. Very, very well-run place. But there are also many places, and I was joking about this at the conference, but I mean it seriously, where the greeter at the door literally can't even tell you where the bathroom is. And I mean that. I mean, I hate to use the word because it's such a negative word, but it's inescapable. There is a presence of flakiness on the New Age culture that's really greater than it should be. Really, really greater than it should be. I had to cancel a radio show the week of our conference at Rice because the host was such a total flake. She had no idea what she was doing. Wow. I was booked to be on this show by a third party, and they weren't answering emails for like a week and a half. And then you get the inevitable email, "We must do this immediately. When are you free tomorrow morning?" And it's like, excuse me, but and that happens a lot. That happens in mainstream life too, of course, and that happens in different industries. But the New Age industry, the New Age world, seems to have really excelled at it. And that's part of reality. That's part of what goes on in the New Age. It goes on more than it should, and it goes on disproportionately within circles that could be called New Age. And I've asked myself why, and my colleagues have asked ourselves why. And the best answer I can come up with is that because New Age is so endorsing, and rightly so, of the radical individual search, some people use it as a kind of escape hatch from the demands and rigors of outer life. For some people, a lack of accountability, for example, which is so detrimental in outer life and so does such a disservice to your relationships with other people, to what you owe other people, and so on. Some people, rather than dealing with that in themselves, almost turn a vice into a virtue and say, well, I'm really just laid back. I'm really laid back. And so they kind of flee into New Age territory where being laid back is supposed to be some sort of a virtue. And of course, there's a very big difference between being laid back and being unaccountable. I would describe Jeff Kripal, our Pope, as being laid back. But Jeff is a rigorously accountable man on every level. Being unaccountable is something totally different. In fact, I think being unaccountable, in a sense, is a form of hostility, because look at the result that it has in the lives of other people. It confuses them, it makes them nervous, it makes them do extra work. That's actually the kind of thing that hostility does too in a workplace, for example. You got a certain unsteadiness, a certain uncertainty. Unaccountability and hostility are probably linked in an interesting way. And within New Age culture, growth centers, metaphysical churches, different digital operations, publications, you find a disproportionate amount of that in my experience. That's the shadow side of New Age. That's the negative New Age, if I can put it in those terms. And you also find its opposite. But I think one has to be willing to look at that in a very plain way. So in my talk, I was trying to be very frank about the things that I've encountered and the colleagues of mine have encountered within the New Age world. The critics are not always wrong, but the critics miss so much. They miss the fact that there's all these other good things coming out of this conference. Would the critics know who Gary Lackman is? Would the critics know who Jeff Kripal is? Would the critics even know what the term Gnosticism means? Or could they come up with a rough back-of-the-envelope description of it? Probably not in most cases. There was a scholarly biography recently written of Oprah Winfrey, and I was struck by it. I was talking about this at Queens College a few months ago, actually. The person who wrote the book seemed to render almost every sentence with this dripping sarcasm, this eye-rolling, this dismissive tone, this tone of sarcasm, without ever once defining why. Why this derisive tone and attitude towards her subject, which is Oprah Winfrey. What's the problem? What's the trouble? She felt it was so self-evident, and apparently her editor and publisher felt it was so self-evident that it never even required definition. That is the absolute closing down of inquiry, scholarly or otherwise. And that's an attitude that's pervasive in our culture, especially within journalism. And this wasn't journalism. This was a scholarly biography published by an academic press, where you would think definitions, foundational definitions, are basic to every work, and they certainly are. There was never a definition of why the tone of sarcasm, why the caustic tone, and it permeated almost every page of the book. It was striking. It was really striking. As if to say, we all just take for granted that this is garbage, that this is nonsense, but we have to explore it because it's such a popular cultural phenomenon. And I would challenge that person and say, have you demonstrated that anywhere in your book? Is there a foundational definition or description of who your subject is or what your subject does that justifies this tone of sarcasm or contempt that seems to permeate the book? And that's the problem with studying New Age figures. Historians, journalists, writers, they seem to veer towards one margin or another. They seem to veer either towards contempt or adoration, and neither is sufficient. Being within the New Age culture myself, I feel neither contempt nor adoration. I hope I feel a mature sense of love and regard for the culture, and as one adult loves another, one adult can also see the flaws in another, and vice versa. And we have to be frank about that, and we have to be able to talk about that if we're going to document these movements in a serious way. So that's what I was trying to do in my talk, and I was so thrilled with how it was received, because we really avoided sliding towards the margins in one way or another.
I enjoyed it too. And again, for the listener, go to Mitch's YouTube page and you'll get the whole enchilada. And another thing that you addressed, and we addressed it in the Q&A and beyond, was the idea that it's almost like a trap. On one hand, they say that New Age isn't measurable. On the other hand, if there is results, like me going to AA and staying sober, it's a delusion. So, yeah, that seems to be two issues you addressed.
Yeah. When people look upon New Age beliefs or cafeteria religion, and of course, we're necessarily defining this in a very, very broad way, in a very general way, but we sometimes have to use generalities in order to be able to communicate with one another. If somebody is invested in therapeutic spirituality and they experience results as measured in conduct, that can't be called a delusion. How else would you measure a result? If you take an ethical or religious idea or some sort of a therapeutic idea and you apply it to somebody's life, whether in the area of medicine, mood, recovery, and they experience an increased productivity, they experience an authentic recovery as reflected in stable relationships, career progress, the ability to accomplish stated identified goals, long-term and short-term in outer life, you have a success. You have a success. And the only empiricism that we really have on the inner path is, first of all, an inner empiricism, which is very hard to measure. It comes in the testimony of the individual, and an outer empiricism, which can be measured in the individual's conduct of life. And I insist that we have to apply some practical measures to the religious experience. Because if not, why should the individual invest himself in it? And if not, how to respond to critics who call religion a delusion in general? Again, if you're calling something a delusion, but you're ignoring its manifest effects in the testimony and the daily conduct of the individual, it's just an expression of a subjective opinion. As I said at the conference, it's like saying chocolate ice cream is bad or chocolate ice cream is evil. It's a senseless statement. It just doesn't mean anything. You're actually just spouting off an opinion, almost like an act of road rage, and there's nothing there to really debate. If you're going to say something is good or bad in one way or the other, then you have to talk in terms of results. And that's true for religious ideas as it is for medical ideas or anything else. Those results have to be evaluated in terms of the outer conduct of the individual and in terms of the individual's testimony, which I take very seriously too. But I think we have to be brave about talking about results and trying to find ways to measure these things, whether in testimony, whether in outer performance, or in other ways.
Agreed, and well said. And your paper, I found, really complements April DeConnick's The Gnostic New Age, because it does show the parallels, how both were ecumenical, they were syncretic, but they also turned traditional ideas upside down, and they sort of drew from a wide well of ideas, threw them on the wall, and created this revolutionary ideology. And
Yes.
the only difference, and I think you mentioned this, is that the Gnostics they were on the run from the get-go. They were always on their heels. They were never really in a position to make money, while New Age has been, commercially very successful.
Yes, it sure has. It's been commercially very successful. And of course, we have to celebrate and protect the fact that in the Western world and in other parts of the world, there's been the freedom, there's been the religious and intellectual elbow room and latitude for people to engage in these searches. To me, the most important and the most significant ideal or principle of our country is the protection of the individual search for meaning. And as long as that's still happening, something is working. Something is succeeding in our society. When the individual search for meaning experiences a compression, experiences a breakdown, experiences failure, then we're really in trouble. Then we are really, really in trouble. I think our society probably can weather a wide variety of political and economic storms, although I certainly take very seriously the human toll that is suffered in the wake of economic storms. But I think there's a lot of friction that our society can deal with. The real breakdown point comes when the individual search for meaning gets compromised, is no longer protected. And there are people out there who get harassed, particularly within the cultures of paganism or Wicca or the occult. You know, there are serious and alarming cases in our country where, you know, somebody, let's say, is giving tarot readings at a local New Age store, and some people try to block this activity through invoking blue book laws or zoning laws or some sort of municipality laws or anti-fortune telling laws saying, you know, hey, you're not allowed to do that. You're engaged in commercial activity here that's not permitted, where they're really just objecting religiously to what the individual is doing. And people who practice astrology or tarot or Wicca or any form of neo-paganism or New Age or esoteric or occult spirituality are exercising their fundamental First Amendment rights. And any spiritual or any commercial or zoning or municipal statutes that are used to disrupt that, and some of that is going on today, is really a profound violation of the constitutional exercise of the individual. And I'm alarmed by that. I'm concerned by that. That is going on. That is real. There are also wonderful exceptions to that, but we have to be very vigilant across the board that nobody is being squeezed out in any way or harassed out in any way of their right to search for meaning. And sometimes that right intertwines with a commercial right. I mean, look, here in New York State, as in other states, I live in New York City, there are these anti-fortune telling laws on the books. Now, these anti-fortune telling laws are really intended to prevent fake mediums from charging people ruinous sums of money to help them avert some bad vibes or something like that. They're meant to protect people from fraud. But the laws, as they're currently written, are very broad, and they can be dangerous to the search. Now, for example, let's say you come from the Hindu religion, the Hindu tradition. Now, traditionally speaking, almost every Hindu couple that is engaged to be married goes to a Vedic astrologer and has a chart drawn up to try to figure out the propitious date or time for their marriage, to try to figure out what frictions they might face as a couple, to try to kind of navigate through some of the issues of marriage. That's a traditional practice within Hindu culture. Now, the astrologer is very entitled to be paid for his or her services, just as clergy are paid for everything that they do. There are very few clergy who don't get paid for officiating at a funeral or a wedding or a bar mitzvah, or you name it. So how can you possibly say that an anti-fortune telling law, for example, unless it's very, very narrowly written, could stand up against a constitutional challenge when the tarot reader, the astrologer, whatever, is expressing and practicing his or her own religious tradition, very strictly so, as in the example I was just citing of the Vedic astrologer visiting with the engaged couple, and they're entitled to be paid for that work. My mother-in-law is a justice of the peace in the state of Massachusetts. She performs weddings. She's entitled to be paid as an officiant at those weddings, as is, you know, a rabbi or imam or whoever. So, you know, there's probably going to be a constitutional challenge sooner or later, and I'd be very happy to be part of it, to some of these state anti-fortune telling laws. We have to watch these things very carefully. These are not the only religious problems or trouble spots we face, heaven knows. I'm just particularly sensitive to them because of my proximity. But we have to really watch very, very carefully that in these fractious times of ours, the individual search for meaning does not come under fire, because that to me is the foundation of everything in this country. There's lots of important things that go on in our society. You know, there's commerce and, you know, all kinds of things that are happening that all need to proceed in an orderly way. But the underpinning of it all is this personal search for meaning. It's what makes our society unique, or should make our society unique. And of course, ours is not the only one. I mean, there's other societies that have enshrined these rights, but they require constant vigilance. We can withstand a lot, but we cannot withstand an erosion of the personal search for meaning. And in a way, the search gets protected by people who are on the fringes, because nobody's going to challenge Episcopalianism. Nobody's going to challenge some mainstream religious expression. What people wind up challenging are the more far out religious expressions, which is why, that's one reason among others, why we should honor and value New Age culture, because the margins actually protect us. Not only do innovations very often emerge from the margins, but the margins are where test cases usually occur and where precedents get established that protect the rest of us. So that's another reason to be nice to your local New Ager today.
Yes, indeed. And this is an issue I'm sure you've dealt with. And it's an issue that perhaps should be addressed at the next conference, or some scholar can talk about, because it's all there in the social media spheres and the blogospheres. And that's the issue of appropriation. And it must be hard, because New Agers and ancient Gnostics, it was pretty much mandatory that you would appropriate as much as possible to gain enlightenment, insights, or whatever. What do you think about the issue of appropriation?
That's a heavy question in our times. I would remind people that, as you were alluding very rightly, religious appropriation has been going on since the beginning of recorded history. The Roman Empire would blow into some new territory, and they would wind up adopting Persian or Judaic ideas, or what have you. The early Christians would import ideas from the worship of Jupiter and from every nature festival that you could possibly imagine. Which is why our Judeo-Christian holidays are very heavily marked by festivals that fall in line with different things happening within the solar chart and different things related to the movement of the cosmos, the vernal equinox, etc. So we live in a syncretic religious world. We always have and we always will. It's just the nature of things. I remember several years ago, I was with a little tour group of kids being taken through the Jewish Museum on the Upper East Side of Manhattan. And within the Jewish Museum, and it's worth visiting, there is a recreation of an ancient, probably Roman-era synagogue. And on the floor of this recreated synagogue, which is recreated from ancient tile and the ruins of this ancient place of worship, is a zodiac wheel, looking every bit like the zodiac wheel that you'd find, you open your daily newspaper horoscope column. And the tour guide, and I found this kind of a piece of misinformation being directed at the kids, which I later corrected. Kids are entitled to know the truth. The tour guide hastened to say, "Oh, this was just decorative. This wasn't something that was part of the service or the liturgy. It was just decorative, just decorative." That's absolutely false. That's simply false. She was just worried politically that, somebody would go home and say to mom and dad, "Hey, we went to see an ancient synagogue and it had a zodiac wheel, so why can't I read my daily horoscope?" Good question. So, and the fact is, the early church, various Judaic movements, various pagan nature-based Hellenic movements, Eastern movements, they were all clip and pasting from one another. They were all borrowing from one another. That's not the only time I've seen a zodiac wheel in connection to ancient Judaism. I've seen it several times. And ancient people were deeply attentive to the stars and borrowed things from Egyptian culture and Babylonian culture and Vedic culture and anybody they came into contact with. Religious syncretism is the history of religion, and it is the practice of religion. So you're going to find syncretism throughout our world, whether it's readily visible or not. It's more visible within the New Age world because people speak in terms of cafeteria religion, another one of these terms that's used as an epithet, of course, and that was designed as an epithet, but I don't view it as such. I think it's actually just a more transparent version of what's been going on throughout human history, maybe with some speed and some adrenaline in its system. But nonetheless, these are the times we live in. There's a flood of information, and people are going to use that information, sometimes in very intimate ways. I don't think it connotes a lack of seriousness. Experimenting is never unserious. Individuals can be unserious in their own personal style, but I don't think a movement that is highly syncretic has to stand in guilt in front of anybody. And I've had these impulses myself to say, oh, you know, the New Agers are too readily borrowing and clipping and pasting things. But then I kind of pull back and I say, wait a minute. How do I know that? Let's see where this goes.
To end, for the listener, where they can find out more about you.
Sure. My website is my name, MitchHorowitz.com. You can throw Mitch Horowitz into Google. You'll find lots of things, articles, lectures, videos, books, my own website. If somebody wants to write me, they can reach me through my website. And throw my name into Amazon. You'll find lots of recorded programs, including many of the books of Neville, including my forthcoming book, The Miracle Club, which can be pre-ordered now. So just to put me into Google, I'm very easy to find.
Wonderful. Well, there you have it. I think that's all the time we have today, Mitch, and certainly look forward to having you back on when your new book comes up. But thank you very much for coming on Aeon Byte and discussing a whole stew of wonderful heretical ideas.
Thank you, man. It's been a real pleasure.
And there you have it. Oh, you spiritual entrepreneurs and modern-day Tom Sawyers. Your mind not for rent by any god or government. The first part of our interview with Mitch Horowitz. In our second part, Mitch continues the notion of appropriation in New Age, occultism, and magic, as well as more on the Gnostic America Conference. He also discusses how to survive in these digital times when any idea can spark a social media witch hunt, often by false witches, and how civility is more important than ever. And are we heading to a revolution in North America? Mitch shares his ideas on the notion of consciousness, the alt-right, and the cult of Kek, and gives some love to an overlooked esoteric exemplar, Neville Goddard, and more, all bigly gnosis. To gain the second part, please go to thegodabovegod.com and scroll halfway down for means to become a member or patron at Patreon. You'll also find many of the benefits, including joining our Inner Sanctum of Gnosis Facebook group, where the conversations are breathtaking and, yes, so civil. Your support solely keeps this Red Pill cafeteria open. I can't do it without you. Nobody is getting rich here, and we are reaching more and more cats on the internets, giving individuals a chance to wake up to their own Promethean destiny. And as I always say, if you got holes in your pocket, simply message me, and I'll send you a complete show on the burning house. Thank you so much for those of you who support on a weekly basis, either by becoming a member or through donations. Thanks to my team of Luthien and Vance will be joining us in the next show on the Archons, as the scheduling Archons get tamed. Most of all, thanks for being here on this dark odyssey through the gnashing rocks of orthodoxy, all the way to the farthest shores of imagination. Goodbye, and hello, as always.